Hello, Professor Kent Lee here. In this video, I would like to talk about the idea of evidence in academic research writing and what it means. Evidence means information, data, or such that leads clearly to a particular conclusion. It points clearly to one particular conclusion. And that means it's not ambiguous. It's not something that could point to two or more multiple conclusions, but it points clearly to one conclusion. Think of a crime investigation. Evidence would be some kind of information that points clearly to one person as, the murderer or the robber. Like, there are fingerprints there. Okay, that could be anybody, but it's the fingerprints of a particular person. That means, oh, he did the murder. He did the robbery. It points clearly to one conclusion. And that's what evidence means. So, for example, when you hear about conspiracy theories and all kinds of wild claims that are popular on the internet today, the evidence is extremely weak. It's not really evidence. It's circumstantial. Like it's from the circumstances. In other words, the evidence that, there are some aliens that are controlling our governments, our politicians are aliens, or there's some evil communist conspiracy that's controlling the world governments. All the evidence is circumstantial. It's extremely ambiguous. It could be interpreted many different ways. There's no evidence ever presented that clearly points to some kind of evil conspiracy going on here. And that's the truth with many political conspiracies, whether it's claims that Biden stole the election or Obama is an alien or all these politicians are secret members of a secret, communist conspiracy trying to take over the world. There's no real evidence. It's circumstantial data, circumstances that could point to anything. It could point probably more likely to normal, everyday, mundane explanations that any political scientist or economist could provide you. So evidence points clearly to one conclusion. It's logical support in an argument. And let's say in research, let's look at different kinds of research and what counts as evidence in different kinds of research. First, I'll take kind of more exploratory or subjective kinds of research, some exploratory qualitative research, interpretive research, theoretical research, for example, in literature studies, in theoretical linguistics, in philosophy, and such. Evidence it's not hard scientific evidence, but it's going to fill some criteria like these. It's going to explain things. It should be able to explain all of the facts that are presented, or all of the facts that one could, raise in an argument or in a debate. It should be able to explain things. It should be able to explain things well. It should be consistent with all of the facts, all of the data. It should be logically consistent within itself, and it should be consistent with all possible data that you could find that's relevant. And it should provide some new insights into what you're looking at. So, for example, in a literature paper, you're arguing for your analysis of a particular poem. So your thesis is this new interpretation or new way of interpreting this poem or the various poems of a particular writer. It should explain all of the relevant details and all the facts, all the data. It should be consistent with what the poem says and does, and the way that the writer uses language. It should be consistent with everything that we already know. It should be logically consistent with the facts, and the theory should be or your thesis, your idea, your conclusion should be consistent within itself. And you shouldn't make contradictory claims, and you shouldn't rely on logical fallacies, of course. And it should provide new insights. It should provide a new and interesting way of looking at the poem that makes sense. It might be really interesting and novel and cool, but it should make sense and it should be consistent with everything else. Same is true if you're using some theory to critique, political discourse or philosophical argument or some kind of interpretive or exploratory qualitative paper. You do a qualitative study of how language learners feel, a certain group of language learners feel in a certain language environment. You do interview data and use some theory in your field to interpret their data. Your conclusions should, be consistent. You should have evidence in your paper and explanations that not only explain all of the facts and they're consistent with what we already know, maybe from other research papers on this, but it's consistent within itself, and it provides interesting new insights that might not be something anyone could have thought of. It might be really unique and creative insights, but it should make sense. It should be consistent with what we already know about this topic and such. When it comes to more empirical papers, especially more quantitative and scientific papers where you've got a research hypothesis and you're trying to prove it, well, it should meet the sort of forensic or legal criteria I gave before with the crime example. It should point clearly to one explanation. This is the best explanation. So it could be what we call forensic or like crime scene or legal evidence. That, well, the criminal has had motive, the criminal had a reason to do it, the criminal had an opportunity to do it. Not only that, but there is some clear evidence that the criminal actually did it, like fingerprints or, gunpowder residue on their hand, or something that clearly points to that person being the criminal. And with experimental papers, of course, your experimental evidence, you do an experiment and the experiment should be consistent with one interpretation. That is, the results of your experiment or your analysis should be consistent with one and only one interpretation, which is your conclusion or your interpretation. Some examples. I have done some research on English medium instruction, the EMI policy at Korean universities. In my previous job, I worked at a university. Now I was teaching English as a foreign language, but I sometimes, dealt with professors who were in other departments who were affected by this policy. And the policy states that in most departments, new professors have to teach their courses in English and students have to take a certain number of courses in English, graduate and undergraduate students. And this was true for all kinds of departments where English may or may not have been relevant. Business courses, but also philosophy courses, history courses, engineering courses, chemistry courses, biology courses. Most any course, this affected most departments at the university. And while I kind of like the idea of having some courses in English in different majors in different areas, I'm all for that. The way that this policy was applied kind of across the board, like everyone, all departments have to do it, or almost all departments have to do it, and all new professors have to do this, and almost all students, at least in most departments, have to take a certain number of English courses taught in English in their major. Yeah, I was critical of this. I didn't agree with the way this was being applied. And so I published at least one paper, where I collected evidence. And in this case, it was from graduate students. I looked at graduate students. And the evidence showed that the policy wasn't really working for graduate students. So what was the policy trying to do? It was intended to improve students' English skills, and particularly their English skills regarding their major, their field of study. So, a biology student should have improved ability to use English for doing biology and writing biology papers and communicating, talking about biology research in academic or later maybe job settings. And that was kind of the stated purpose of the EMI policy. And as I did, I administered quantitative surveys to graduate students, and I looked at things like, okay, how do you feel about your English abilities in specific areas, reading, writing, etc., your motivation, your confidence toward English. And I looked at other data like, okay, how many of your classes are taught in English? How many have you taken so far? And I did some statistical analysis, and so the quantitative data showed that graduate students weren't really ready for this, that they had a lot of problems. They realized that their English wasn't really ready for taking courses and doing coursework in English. Even though they're graduate students, their English wasn't really ready for that. So I have evidence from how they rate their English abilities and the amount of English courses taught in English that they've taken, their motivation. I looked at their psychological aspects of their motivation. So I have data from several different points, general self-ratings of English, comfort levels, number of English courses, motivation, etc., leading to the conclusion that the graduate students weren't ready for this kind of learning, or they weren't benefiting from it, and this calls into question the policy. So that's evidence. You would probably need to do more research to really come to a consensus in the education community, but at least I found evidence that's consistent with one conclusion, that graduate students aren't really prepared or ready for this kind of learning environment. And I've collected a lot of data from undergraduates, which I have not quite analyzed, did a little analysis, but something similar. I did a lot of surveys with undergraduate students. I've got survey data from about 500 or so undergraduate students, college students, and I need to do a full analysis. And similar findings, evidence from how they rate their English abilities, from the number of courses they've taken, their motivation, questions about that kind of, probe their motivation. What kind of motivation do you have? Their motivation, and things like that. And what I find is, again, a lot of undergraduates in many departments aren't ready for this. They aren't really prepared for this kind of learning environment. And it's especially worse for certain students who have weak English skills, and it's especially worse for a lot of the foreign students who come from, say, other Asian countries, who really struggle with the English courses taught in English in different majors. I will try to analyze that and publish that someday. I hope to publish that someday. So I've got evidence, I've got data that is consistent with the conclusion that the undergraduate college students are not really ready for this and may not benefit from this kind of learning environment. I've also got qualitative data from professors that I've interviewed, and I plan to analyze and publish that someday. But from the interview data that I have, I can tell you I've got qualitative evidence from several different points, different aspects, that are consistent with the conclusion that professors are not ready or prepared for teaching courses in English. New professors who may have gotten their PhD in the US, but they're not really ready to teach a course in English. And it comes from several different points or aspects. They have trouble expressing themselves in English. They have trouble covering the course contents in English, and they have to cut out a lot of contents. And they can tell the students, a lot of students are having trouble understanding, and sometimes they have to kind of find ways around the policy in order to help the students and such. So, and sometimes it causes them a lot of personal stress having to do this, having to prepare lessons and then lecture in English. It's very stressful for them. So again, I've got different kinds of data or information that all point to the conclusion that professors are not really ready. Most professors are not ready for this. They're not able to do this very effectively, and it's not good for the learning environment. That's evidence. So when you're writing a paper and you're doing research, it's your own analysis, your own thesis, no matter what subject you're doing, ask yourself, would a skeptical reader find your arguments and your evidence persuasive? Not that they would necessarily agree with you. Even if they disagree with you, would they find your evidence to be at least plausible, fairly convincing? Even if they don't agree with it, it would at least be plausible or fairly convincing. It would make sense to them. It would be consistent with the facts, consistent with the data, consistent with reality. That's what evidence is. So something to think about whenever you are doing research writing. So good luck on your research or on your writing, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.